Reflections at Museum Amsterdam, drawing the reader into a relational practice of witnessing that calls for an attunement to the affective, the spiritual, the sonic, the ecological, the ancestral, and the capacious ontological possibilities offered by each register. Only 150 editions of this text exists, and we are very lucky to have one at 32. So thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this dialogue, and we're very excited to have you. I think I'll start by asking you questions about the text itself and this incredible creation, and what it means to both of you, because I understand that you approach these collaborations from both, very different perspectives, both in terms of like your experience and your interests, but also in your academic approaches. So I'm interested to hear how you would describe this book and how you approached the creation of this text.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abul. It's really great to meet you, and thanks again to 32 for hosting this conversation. It's also really great that the first kind of public conversation is with our friends in Uganda. Sometimes we become so used to doing things in the West, and it's really nice to not have to do that in this moment. So thank you very much. Yeah, in terms of our collaboration, I'll probably just start first, and then Zoe, you can of course jump in. Essentially, Zoe and I met in person for the first time on the first day of this project, right? So we were like these DM friends, basically angrily shouting about things in the DMs that we were researching, or that, where our kind of research was really overlapping. Myself working in an ethnographic museum in preparation for my solo show at the Museum in Vienna, and Zoe doing work with photographic archives pertaining to the Nama and Herero genocides in Namibia. And so there was this kind of overlapping interest in archive and the ways in which we were dealing with it. And the moments that I had difficulty in my research in Vienna, I was kind of engaging with Zoe throughout that process, just as kind of like friends who were commiserating about, I guess, the ghosts that you encounter in doing this kind of work. And yeah, that's kind of how it started. And then someone told me about this fellowship, and I figured it would be a really great opportunity for her and I to think together, to work together. Of course, our practices are very different. Myself as someone who's mostly working as an artist and thinking through sound and performativity, and Zoe, of course, has a very, very strong foot in kind of academia and as a critic. And of course, herself, I mean, maybe you can speak to this yourself, Zoe, but also wanting to move more towards a kind of curatorial practice as well, right? So this became an interesting kind of collaboration, and opportunity for us to think together and just do work with like a new friend. I think a lot of this kind of research can be incredibly lonely. And I think I'm just like tired of doing this kind of work by myself for that reason. And I'd rather be haunted with someone than haunted alone. Yeah.
I think for my part, what I found to be really exciting about this is, as Zara described, I'm not an artist. And so I don't get to make things. And so it's been really nice to be able to kind of inhabit more of her sensibility as an artist and produce. I mean, I understand this as much as it is like a text that's thick and dense, and we're working through all of these things that are haunting us and all of these violences that we're confronting. But it's also just like very beautiful. I mean, I can't speak to the production, that's all Zara. But it's like holding this thing and the way that it's arranged. I think that academia can be quite droll in the sense that, we're kind of stuck on the screen or in a book that it has design. But I think the process of putting this together and kind of visualizing and materializing all of these violences and presenting it to others, I think that there's an interesting maybe cathartic metabolism of some of these ideas that have a really ready audience for so many different kinds of people in so many different places. And so I think that sitting with the way that Zara engages sound as both these kind of archival objects and also the kind of sonic practice itself has been really wonderful in forcing me into a very different kind of medium. And that's something that I've deeply, deeply appreciated in the process of doing this.
And I think the collaboration actually, like, I see like different strengths coming across. Yes, you're writing from a very like, you know, musical perspective, and you also, like Zara explains like a lot about music that I also never learned. So I can imagine how it was to inhabit that space, because I myself was also inhabiting that space as I read through the text, and also how your sections and your specific chapters included aspects of your research as well. So I think the collaboration really comes through. And I think I want to get into some readings. I suggested a few readings, and I think I wanted Zara, I don't know if you're interested in reading the parts of your introduction that I highlighted, just so that people can understand what the text is about.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm just gonna like read verbatim, and I tried to like sticky note little sections, so hopefully I've got them right. Okay, so this is from like the second page or whatever of the introduction. In many ways, this work is rooted in sound and death epistemologies from the Southern African Black cosmological archives. It uses them to navigate through and make sense of the ontological foreclosures disseminated through colonial expansion and European edification as presented by the horrors of museum collection management. As such, this project is concerned with the affective and the ancestral, with grief and internment, though perhaps less with the already delineated discourse around the repatriation and restitution of looted material, which mostly play out at a political and bureaucratic level between nation states. A funeral for thus asks how we may engage the visual in a way that doesn't perpetuate the ocular centricism of the empirical imperial tradition. Indeed, there is an irony in trying to create art whilst working in collaboration with a project like Pressing Matter that is in many ways aimed at provenance research. Provenance is, at its core, a trace of positivist knowledge. It is about the act of unveiling and remaking the property relation. Art making is not positivist, nor is it ever complete or definitive. This work positions itself in the poetics and ethics of conviviality and interrelation, in the act of fetching the spirit of the dead, using fragments of research conducted in the aforementioned archives. This work uses land, sound, time, and rapture as method. We ask, what openings exist in the current historic and symbolic order, and how do we make room for different ontological possibilities? This text is attentive to the leaps and other gestures through which we take flight and tend to life-death in and through life-death. This conception of the beingness of being Black and indigeneity is not about recuperating the human dominion, elevation, reason, possessing an essence, or reestablishing an alternative center. It is neither post-human nor entirely constitutive of the natural, animal, spiritual, and ancestral worlds. For me, archival work is about pushing up against the indexical while simultaneously being subjected to its very fact. It is about thinking through the choreography of what is transient within the archive. The question of repair is less about the repair of the museum or even the repair of the collection material, but rather a repair of the approach to working with collection materials. This entails a reorientation of the terms of engagement, demanding a relooking, re-listening, and reframing, both in terms of research methodology and research or creative output, and the possibility of bypassing hypothesis altogether. This publication is is a testament to how meaning making is not a unidirectional process, but a relational process of dispersion where simultaneity of contested, oppressive, and resistive meaning making can occur. Was that the end of the section?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
cool.
I really enjoyed this section in the introduction. I think you introduced a variety of like this concept well, and it also got me thinking a lot about the images that you used in the text. And there's this historian named okay, sorry. I hope it's better now. Yeah, but there's this historian called Harvey Neptune who talks about this concept of like how archives appear. And by appear, he means how they come to exist, but also how they seem to the people who are viewing these archives. And it was such an interesting thing to look at the archives and to also, you know, here you say this publication is a testament to how meaning making is not a unidirectional process, but a relational process of dispersion, where simultaneity of contested, oppressive, and resistive meaning making can occur. And I think that really came across well, because as I was flipping through the pages, I see this archives that you also are, you know, very intentional to make sure they register on different frequencies, right? So looking at land and their expanses of land, which, you know, also just evokes these ideas of how travel image, like the travel photography, which is like a very Western way of perceiving like Africa through landscapes and through animals as opposed to human beings. But then you also choose these images of human beings, and they appear really powerful. But then it's also like I have to ensure that I'm, you know, considering the fact that they were not like the way that these images were taken is, you know, very potentially violent, right? It's definitely violent, and I look at them and there's a moment where I can almost miss that. So I'm just wondering what the process of selecting these archives was for you, and how yeah, how you came across, like how you decided what to show. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, the ethnographic photograph is incredibly seductive, right? And I think it's important to be honest about how seductive it is. And so that's kind of, I think, what the book really plays with is like the incredible beauty of these images and beauty of these landscapes, and then also the terror that underlies them. But maybe Zoe, you might want to jump in and talk about the process of how we selected some of these images.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the ideas that's really been important for us, and I think we'll read about it when we read another part of the book, is a distinction between history and the past. The past is something that happened, kind of unarguably. History is not necessarily something that has happened. And so in trying to think about how we process and encounter these images, you know, they inhabit kind of different kinds of spaces. These are recordings of people and things undoubtedly that existed. But the ways that they're positioned in history, the kind of landscape of understanding that is created by colonialism is entirely different, or can be entirely different from what the past actually is. So I'm sorry, can you hear my washing machine in the back?
No.
Okay, good. I'm so sorry. It is so loud over here. I'm like, why did I do this? Okay. So the way that we went through the images, God, it was a lot of fun at the end, but a real slog at the beginning, because we had to work through the data management system of the museum system called TMS, which can be quite hard to use. Like we had a little 101 session with the archivist, and it's about like typing in a certain combination of words, either in English or in Dutch, and then it's going through everything that comes up when you search these words. And sometimes the label is wrong, and sometimes the label is more correct, or sometimes the label is correct, but incredibly racist. And so in going through all of this, we got a little bit used to some of the rhythms of the system and how it kind of organized images, and we selected ones that we found to be interesting. We were able to see some of the image collections that were assembled by previous researchers, because all of the collections are saved in TMS. So we were also able to interact with other people's slog through the archive as well. And then when we had a whole bunch of images, then we tried as best as we could to select images that had more complete descriptions, because it felt important to us that even if we're playing with the kind of the beauty and the terror and these kind of like affective registers, that it was very important that the context of the image, even if it is this awful historical context of the kind of colonial archive, still existed. That was something that we did not want to kind of absent, even if we were trying to do something different with the pictures. And so they're kind of positioned through the book a little bit thematically. Sometimes the images have a little bit more of a direct relationship to whatever section that they're in. Sometimes it was a matter of, if they're not within a section, kind of what kind of story can get told in the sequencing of the images, and how do these things kind of look together, kind of bringing together people and built environment, and natural environment, another kind of colonial binary, and then brought it all together.
If I may jump in, I think just for the audience, just for context, so this archive that we're speaking about is at the Dutch World Museum. And they essentially, it's a conglomerate of a variety of museums in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Leiden. Yeah, those are the three main sites, and all those museums have different histories, right? So the museum within the Amsterdam has more kind of, it was called like the tropical museum, so like the Museum of the Tropics. That's kind of that particular history. But Leiden, as an example, is like one of the oldest ethnographic museums in the world. And Rotterdam has more of a kind of trade relationship, and obviously true to the kind of tropical museum, it's about saying like, what is there at the tropics for us to take, basically. So like this museum has a lot of these kind of like land surveying photographs that we maybe see as kind of like travel photography now with our own eyes, but it's not that at all. It's about surveying the land that is ripe for the picking, right? And accompanying this particular archive is also a room of mineral samples from across the global south. Little pieces of rock, literally, labeled according to the geographic context in which it was taken, and it really is in pursuit of empire. But so that's just one thing for context. And another thing I think with regards to the TMS, the digital system that you kind of have to use, is that it was built by the Getty Foundation, right? So it was built for a kind of less, I don't want to say not complicated, but perhaps less complicated art context where provenance is perhaps a little bit less complicated or less disputed. The names or the titling of particular artworks that you would capture in that context would be quite clear and cut. The date of all the information would be, a lot of it is a lot less complicated, right, in these kinds of contexts. But as soon as you enter into this ethnographic museum context where things have basically been pillaged, all questions of provenance become big question marks, right? And you really are, in trying to, as a researcher going into that space, you really are contending constantly with the epistemic frameworks of the museum's entire history of curators, because they're the ones who are entering in these titles. So you kind of at the helm of the ways in which these people think or have thought. A lot of them, obviously, it goes back hundreds of years. So that's really what you're caught up against. So often when I go into museums to do research, I just want to see everything so that I'm not really bound by the way things are being cataloged by a particular person with a particular viewpoint. So it really requires a different kind of time, actually. It's like you have to really rejig the way you understand time and research. And a lot of curators find it incredibly frustrating to work with me because I'm like, show me all the loot, like all of it. I just want to see everything, and then I want to understand how the logic of these collections have been constructed by all these different curators and so-called collectors or ethnographers, what have you, missionaries over time. Like that's what gets me going. And so that's really what informed, I think, a lot of the ways in which we encountered the collections. Yeah.
Okay, that's really, really cool. And that actually leads into what I want to ask about next, because I hope you can hear me well. So I really enjoyed listening to like your experience of, looking at this archives. And I think it leads me into Sight by Zoe Samudzi, your writing. And it also talks about seeing and where we see, and you introduced this concept of refractive seeing. I don't know if you mind reading from the section that yeah.
Unlike Zara, I did not use sticky notes, so please just give me a moment to find this.
I think of the SSI.
Did we put a table of contents? Should we?
No, we didn't. It's page 130.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, what is return?
Oh, sorry, that's return. Excuse me.
It is at the beginning.
Yeah. White site is a key operating system.
Yes. Yo, this is embarrassing. Okay. Yo. Sorry. Okay, I found it. So we're starting with white site, which is a very, very useful concept that I have been deeply appreciative of getting from visual studies kind of scholar Nicholas Mirzoff. Okay. White site is a key operating system of what it is to make whiteness. White site does not see everything there is to see, but projects a white reality. Any failure to conform to this reality is corrected with violence. So this is from Mirzoff. The constitution of seeing is the simultaneity of its shift and stability, transformation and restabilization. To say that vision, racialized sight, both transmutes and remains the same is to claim that seeing is refractive. So-called objects in museums, objectified ancestral remains, sacred artifacts, ritual materials, quotidian throwaways, nevertheless rarefied in their exhibition, are subjected to this refractivity. They're transformed by imperial plundering and capitalist enclosure, rendered scarce and valuable and redefined within their new context. The obsessively indexical anthropological and documentation offers evaluation and assessment. They are things to edify publics who gaze or glance and then move on to the next, one of the many, many in the racial grids called ethnological museums. Recognizing this refractivity spares us the heartache of reclaiming things stolen from us because we are able to understand that the stolen object will never again be what it once was, even upon its return to its origins. Refracted seeing instead becomes a method and heuristic for seeing across space and time. There are two conditions that govern this seeing. One, a given object or material is altered upon its entrance into or passage through a space. As in physics, the interface between two spaces inflects or refracts the condition of an object whose existence is dynamic but rendered as fixed and inanimate by its incarceration. Transformation can be nominal, through renaming or misnaming, ontological, the metaphysical change via holding, or chemical, or toxic substances are often applied for the sake of preservation, but it is always metaphysical. An object can never be returned to its original state, i.e., the state it inhabited or the meaning it contained upon its creation. Refracted seeing, however, is an anti-state visuality that refuses the state's conciliatory gesture of restitution, property relation, and claims to capital ownership inherent in establishments of provenance. Refracted seeing is a means of attempting to understand the sovereignty of catastrophic art.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very interested in this idea of refractive seeing and how important it is for us to understand like how these objects are transformed. The transformations that occur in this process of extracting the object and then preserving it also raises questions on how we should interact with it upon its return. So in your context, how did you say apply a refractive seeing of the images within this text?
Yeah, I mean, so the concept of refracted seeing came from like this very annoying process of trying to do physics. Of trying to come up with some and I have to say I don't know physics, so I had to recruit my father to help me with this one. But I was trying to find something that brings together the formulas for like seeing and like waves and then for sound. Um and I don't remember what it was because it like wasn't very interesting, but in the process of it and in learning all of these different formulas, I was learning the formula for reflection, refraction, and dispersion. So when I use those words, they're actually coming from this attempted experiment of trying to kind of, I mean, fuck with physics, because I think that there's, even as people insist that there's like something empirical about science, I mean, this is a kind of colonial construction of um, how the world works, period, with no argument. Um, and so what refracted seeing did, what was usable from that experience, from that experiment, and what was important to us is to refuse the kind of cultural essentialism that can sometimes come up when we talk about the pasts or indigenous histories that are associated with objects in the archive, because in both of our contexts in Southern Africa and in South Africa and Zimbabwe, there are a lot of really dangerous claims that also become attached to objects in the important push for restitution. And so what felt really important to us is like to understand that these objects have their own agencies. They have these deeply important historical meanings, and they need to be returned to the places where they were created, to be kept in particular ways or to be destroyed. But we don't want to feed this like romantic idea of indigeneity that can also be incredibly dangerous and perpetuate these other forms of nationalism, these other forms of actually quite colonial ways of inhabiting indigenous identities. So even as something returns, it is returning to a place that is not the same as when it was taken, and the thing itself will never be the thing that was taken. But that doesn't mean it's not important. We just have to understand that through all of the different exchanges, from the person who originally stole the object or purchased the object to a collector to the museum, every time it changes hands, it also is imbued with new kinds of meaning. And we can think about it in like a kind of wooey spiritual sense, and we can think about it in a really kind of material and chemical sense. And all of these different properties were important for how we understand things having existed in the past, having existed in a mythological historical moment, and how they can also exist in the future as we're continuously kind of reinterpreting what these histories and pasts are. As we make space for these ancestral remains and artifacts and objects and whatever in these African presents. Yeah. So that was kind of the idea of refracted seeing.
I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it also leads into my next question, which was to do with, like your work has introduced me to this idea of autochthony and the context within the work, but especially how you introduced this idea of strategic essentialism as, as it relates to land claims, both structural and political. And I found that really interesting because obviously I think we're very migratory people within the continent, and this idea of having to claim land also ends up becoming violent. So I definitely wanted to hear more about that, and I don't know if you want to start by reading, or you have like a lot to say on this idea of autochthony, because it comes up in the conversation that you had, which I also put in the reading.
Yeah, I think it's a really important term. So maybe we explain it and then we read, perhaps. Just one quick note on what Zoe has just shared, which I think is so vital to like the ways in which we were working together. And I mentioned this word conviviality in the introduction that I think now is kind of becoming like used as a throwaway term, but we don't really, grapple with what that means. One of my professors in my first degree was a man named Francis Nyamjo, Professor Francis Nyamjo, and he's an anthropologist, and people call him the like conviviality scholar or whatever. But I think it's important, this idea of conviviality, because really it demands a kind of epistemic humility, right? Not just with regards to like what people like to term like African epistemologies and then like Western epistemologies, right? Like we're not interested in this binary understanding, because we also understand even as Africans, we can recapitulate so much violence and the ways in which we understand ourselves, understand each other, categorize, etc., which I think leads me to this question of yours around autochthony, which is really this word that speaks to be autochthonous is essentially to be of a particular place geographically, right? And so I think there's an assumption that it's a synonym for indigeneity, but really it's not. It's really about like who comes from that particular place historically. So in the kind of Southern African context or the Namibian context, there would be the Khoi, the San, the Nama, right? That would be if we're talking about like pure autochthony. And then perhaps we should read this thing, and then maybe if there's like further terms that we want to tease out, because Zoe and I love talking about words and how maybe that's also like a thing that Francis taught me, is how to play with language. But yeah, I just want to get that word, that page number, and then, okay, so it's just from the beginning.
Yeah.
So essentially for the audience, the way this book functions is an introduction, which I wrote, and then we each had 2 essays, short essays, and then we invited 2 external, thinkers to add, and then we had this kind of extended dialogue. And so what we're going to do now is read part of this extended dialogue that we, transcribed. Okay, so what do archives offer us in piecing together the narrativizing of Black death, these moments of extermination? So I started. I'm interested in this question in relation to land, indigenous claims, and of course, human remains, which is your area. But these are very different conversations with regards to cultural objects or material culture. And I'm trying to wrap my head around these nuances, especially with regards to indigeneity and what I know from, say, San or Khoi cultural organizations that are lobbying groups for political access in a domain where they're otherwise, excluded from. I'm wondering the extent to which the people who do want cultural objects back need them to affirm their autochthony, which is a legitimate fight. What I think is a legitimate engagement with strategic essentialism. This is very much in response to a different kind of fight internally to make a political claim. I think the Comaroffs write about this in the New South African Keywords book, with regards to the patenting of the Huria cactus. There's something about the internal anxiety and insecurity that is, in some instances, linked to the setting up of cultural organizations in South Africa. AmaZulu, for example, don't need to set up these organizations. They are a kingdom with a significant political seat and hegemony. They don't need to prove anything in order to gain access to conversations around land and cultural political power. And so in this context, the return of, say, Zulu beadwork, however beautiful and important the art may be, might not really be as urgent. Though, of course, I can't really imagine a context where communities wouldn't want the repatriation of ancestral human remains. But the point is, indigeneity does not always equal minority, does not always equal minority, A and B. One cannot and should not simply translate Aboriginal discourse into other contexts. It does not work. A native is not a native is not a native.
And then the book literally says laughs.
I just forgot that I said that, so I'm like laughing at myself.
This is the problem in the African context, not making these distinctions, or at least trying to think about there being distinctions between native and indigenous. Because what happens when the natives contest one another for claim of the state after independence? You're muted. You're muted.
Zoe, Zara, your audio is off.
Sorry, my bad. Right, and are implicated in various layers of violence and obfuscating the past.
And dispossession, which is the Namibian case and definitely the case elsewhere. What you said about strategic essentialism was really interesting because in a way, it's just another means of doing state citizenship.
Say more?
Like being able to make a claim not to land, but to indigeneity as South African.
Right. The Comoros write about exactly this. I mean, say what you will about them, but their article about culture and essentialism in post-apartheid South Africa really helped me think about this in my undergrad. Strategic essentialism as it relates to indigeneity and land claims, but more useful perhaps is the way Hugo Canham frames Black being as an orientation that is less about precision, but more oceanic. He articulates a poetics of being African that is not unfamiliar to those of us from Southern Africa, and asserts that African Blackness is always in relation and rejects ahistorical definitions of indigeneity that equate indigeneity with autochthony, because, open quotes, the very utility of the indigenous is in its engagement with marginality rather than claims to firstness or legitimacy of place, quotes. I think this is especially important in relation to the minoritization of Black subjectivities in settler post-colonies, but also in relation to the ways African subjectivities can be / are simultaneously Black and indigenous. Mind if I quote him at length? Do you want me to quote him at length, or must I skip this?
I think we can go to the next phrase from Zoe. Yeah.
What digging deep, or not even that deep, into ethnographic archives very quickly shows you is how obsessed Europeans were and still are with the question of authenticity. This fixation on the disappearing races animated this need to capture, photographically and in writing, the natives as they were. I think when we bring together community claims in this history, okay, this might be messy, but bear with me. I think there's a critical and unsettling convergence between the ways communities articulate their identity-based political claims and the colonial fantasy of the native in a loincloth. Eesh. These institutions only want to meet with the chief or however they imagine leadership of a community. So whomever is able to perform this most convincingly is the one who gains the advantage in claims making. Autochthony, indigenous claims, and ethnocultural essentialism, where strategic essentialism is the rationale for asserting political power, can be conditionally useful, but I think it really also backfires in legitimizing the classifications of the state. I think we can maybe stop here. This was a fun conversation to have. There were lots of things we had to cut out.
I can imagine. But yeah, I think these are all really interesting things that also I think relate widely across the continent, just these ideas of like how we have to interact with the state before you interact with any cultural, like, sort of entity, especially when it comes to archives. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to this, specific section. That's one I really wanted to hear, how you came up. Yeah.
I think, like, sure, like, I guess on face value, like, the conversation is around archives, but it's actually really about land, and about, like, understanding, like, we're trying to think through the logics that we apply to thinking about archives and restitution and repatriation, but it is also helping us inform, and vice versa, the ways in which we're understanding our conversations around land and the dispossession of Black people in this country, at least South Africa, and the complexities of the same in Zimbabwe, of land, right? So these two logics are kind of balancing and informing each other. And this conversation, in many ways, this book is actually really about the importance of understanding, like, reshifting the ways in which we understand property. And I think in order to work with archives in a way that is, like, rooted in a kind of, to quote Francis, or sorry, Prof. Nyamjo, that's rooted in a kind of epistemic humility. It really demands that we ask this question that understands the ways in which when it understands that when you raise this question of land, you're speaking about so much more. When you raise this question around human remains, you're speaking about so much more. We're not just talking about land and therefore, like, agriculture and, like, production, right? We're talking about, like, a deep understanding of oneself and the understanding of one's dead, which also informs an understanding of oneself, right? And those kinds of relationships cannot really exist without a conversation around land. So that's just something to kind of extend it, that yes, it's about archives, but it's actually about the stakes, I think, are higher than what's sitting in European museums.
And I think to this point, to kind of nerd out on some, like, etymology a little bit, indigeneity, as Zara had already said in quoting Hugo Canham, is about a relation to a state. And so as I was thinking about what is the distinction between native and indigenous, my mother, when she was young, my mom was born in Rhodesia. There are different parts of her documentation that say, like, Black and native, right? As a Shona person, and Ndebele and Shona people are all kind of these native subjects. But after independence, Zimbabwe becomes a Shona state. Ndebele people become, to some extent, indigenous people, because indigeneity is about this dispossessive relationship to the state. Autochthony, from the, I don't know what the parts are in Greek, but it literally means, like, people sprung from the earth. And in the Greek definition of autochthony, it included mythological figures. So if there is when Zeus turned into a swan and had sex with a lady and she was born over there, that is also an autochthonous figure that becomes a part of the mythology of who is of the land. And so I think that this, again, gets back into our fixation on what is the distinction between history and the past. The past is something that happened. History is this thing that we have all participated, in a fabrication. You have different histories of a community. Within the community, you have contested relationships to land amongst different kinds of people who are trying to make a claim of who is from where. And I think the reason I keep going back to the Nama and Ovaherero in this book, and it's what I've been thinking about for the past few years, what I realized in the ways that they were trying to sue the German government for these ancestral remains that are in New York City, the ways they were pushing for recognition, the way that they're now suing the Namibian government, is that yes, they want their people back that are stuck in the archive. But now we have a problem of landlessness. Because if in our cultures someone doesn't die until they're buried, if their land is now owned by these German-speaking Namibians who are the descendants of these settlers, or by Afrikaners, in order to bury their people on this land, they have to go and ask permission from the property owner. So we have, again, we come back over and over and over to this tension between land and enclosed property. And if they don't get permission from the landowner to bury their people, then that's it, right? We have this enduring death, this enduring wound that is caught up in the property relation that links together the stolen things, their stolen land, and the ways that they have been transformed into indigenous subjects because of how the African state continues their dispossession. So what is at stake for them, and what they've said multiple times it is at stake for them, is getting their land back, both in terms of their own self-determination and in terms of the urgency of their people being able to die properly, or whatever kind of proper death can come from them being buried so belatedly after the atrocities of the genocide in 1904 to 08. And I think, really coming to understand those stakes, and us sitting deeply in the stakes rather than kind of just writing the thing and saying the thing for the sake of it, I think has been really, really important. And another thing that I appreciate deeply in working with Zara, rather than kind of having this conversation over and over and over again in academia, of trying to beg people to understand, no, it's not that I want to win an argument with you, right? It's about, like, I don't think you understand what it means for someone to not be able to bury their dead, to not be able to have their land, to not be able to make a claim to their own sovereignty, and future, and their own history. Um, I don't have to explain this. And I think, again, this is the utility of being able to sit in the hauntedness together rather than in a space that is so alienating from what's at stake.
We're really, really appreciative of the fact that you were able to sit in that hauntedness and also convey these very complex things to us in ways that maybe it's easy for us to forget because we're not engaging with these things directly, but then we're also like brought back into this, this losses, like this various history of losses that we faced. And the title of the book literally being A Funeral For, like, and the way you've studied death in this context. And just, how a lot of this death was violent. It wasn't just like, people dying at the natural end of their lives. It's like they've been killed very violently, and then they've also been, disconnected from, the ability of a proper burial. And yeah, I think really I want to thank you for exploring that. And I don't know how we are on time. Yeah, because I think there was going to be a lot more readings, but I think we should now be open to questions because we could go into reading and discussing these things for as long as we can. So I think I'm going to open the floor to questions. So people from 32 can ask questions by raising a hand, and people online can type in the questions, right? And but if they also want to speak, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you'll also, for the people on the chat online, you're welcome to raise your hand if you have a question, and unmute yourself and ask these questions. One in the stage. Yeah, I have a question. Yes.
Talk into the microphone. Whoa. And now I'm hearing myself. I saw the book online, and then just before this meeting had a chance to saw the physical copy. Hope to be able to get one. I'll reach out, see. But I'm based in the Netherlands, so it should maybe not be too hard. And then I was only able to read the introduction, and the introduction ends with something you've partially for me already answered, but in what we heard so far. But I would still love to maybe hear you speak about it a little bit. So Zara, it comes from your text, but I imagine it resonates with both of you. So I'm just curious. It's this statement: we do not believe in the possibility of altogether recontextualizing these visual objectifications that are there in the material. And, as someone who, from a Dutch positionality, works with colonial archives or material in collections in Uganda that were produced during colonial times. If recontextualization at least is with sort of my Dutch audience, let's say, or a wide audience, is a word that resonates. So for me, it's still a useful word. Well, I think I understand what you mean. But I would love to hear a bit more about that. The limits perhaps, or the problematic side of recontextualizing.
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a variety of things. So like another collaboration that's been very, I guess, important in my practice over the past 6 years has been this kind of ongoing dialogue I've had with Tina Campt, and the ways in which we talk about frequency. Myself as a sound artist, herself as someone who works with images, and understanding that images are not just they're not contained of just what's inside them, that they vibrate at a particular frequency, that they live in a way, they are haptic in a sense, right? Especially those images that we've put into this publication. And so in some senses, what we're trying to get at least one element of that sentence, is understanding that regardless of how our project might be engaging in a reconstituting the ways in which one works with archives, trying to figure out how do we position it from a different type of ethic, these images, the frequency of them, there's a kind of palimpsest that exists, right? And that palimpsest, we cannot undo that palimpsest just by virtue of being two Black women who've put together a book and we're writing about some stuff that people might call radical or whatever, like it's not going to change the palimpsest of the frequency that is really sitting within a lot of this archival material. And so, yes, we might have these incredibly powerful pairings of images that are from different parts of the African continent and the diaspora that undo perhaps the ways in which images from this particular collection are only really shown according to particular geographic boundaries. We might not obey the kind of North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa divide that is so much part of the logic of how archives are really designed and maintained. And so, yes, there's these small ways in which we refuse to obey this kind of logic, right? But we cannot recontextualize the violence. And so that's really, I think, part of what we're trying to get at with that. But yeah, I'm sure Zoe's got stuff to add.
Yeah, if I can give an anecdote. When I was working on an exhibition that I was supposed to do in Dresden that I ended up not doing because I withdrew it, one of the critiques that was made in the way that I was using the photographs was, even as I was doing these conceptual captions and kind of reorganizing these archival images in a way that was very different from the way that the German officer had organized them in his photo albums, I kept all of the original captions. And one of the captions included what is now, I mean, it was then a racial slur. And they were really affronted by the fact that I had included a racial slur, which was ironic because at the day before the opening, they tried to tell me that what I was saying was wrong and historically incorrect, and I couldn't say that Germany hasn't done XYZ. And so I'm sure that in the Dutch context, people are quite keen to want to try to recontextualize colonial images in ways that are a little bit more palatable, and a little bit more kind of malleable for a kind of national imaginary that is really predicated on a level of innocence, and innocence in the Holocaust and innocence in colonialism, despite being one of the world's largest colonial powers. And so I think that there's also a part of our acknowledgement that this full recontextualization is impossible, but I also don't think I don't think we should aspire to try to make it possible, is that I don't think that it serves anyone to sanitize and to kind of erase through this recontextualization the origin of the image. Even as there are people for whom it would feel much, 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 much better. I mean, and I'm not even just talking about Europeans, I'm talking about us as Africans as well, because of a kind of anger and deep grief and sadness and humiliation that actually does come from confronting these objects, even in their beauty. So I think that we should not be able to reconstitute the past in that way, even as we can tell different kinds of stories with the images in the present.
Okay. Is the video is transmitting? Yeah. No. Sorry, hi. Hello. My name is Wanini. I am so glad to be here today. Yes, just before my fellow resident Sonia and I came to this talk, we were at another symposium where we were talking about very similar things with regards to questions of indigeneity and what we are to do as Africans about knowledge and the ruptures of the knowledge. So many things we don't know, both in terms of our cultural heritage and also the events of the rupture. So I'm very excited to get into this book and really dig deep. I don't know if mine is a question or more like a train of thought that maybe y'all can catch and I don't know, expound upon. So I really love this word, autochthony. Autochthony, that's correct. I love what it describes, and I love also what Zoe you said about how Zimbabwe essentially turned into a Shona state. I think this was very much a strategy of the British government because in Kenya, they tried to do the same thing. You know, they tried to make Kenya a Kikuyu state, but that has failed in several ways. But still, there's a very complex relationship that this particular community has with the rest of the country. Because on one hand, that was kind of the first place where the British came and took land from people in ways that are still felt today. Like the rates of poverty are just astounding. But also on the other hand, you have a government that essentially set up this one ethnic group to be very economically entrenched in so many ways and be an oppressor in so many ways. So I'm kind of curious to know how one navigates that tension, even when talking about indigeneity, because it's not that Shona people or Kikuyu people or any of the other ethnic groups in Kenya that were privileged in this way are not indigenous, but also there's all these other things happening. It's like you are not exempt from any of the things, despite also being given these crumbs of power. So how do we make this stuff more legible? This is something I'm thinking very deeply about in my work as well, because I do a lot of thinking about interdependence. Mine is a more ecological approach to how we interact with each other in the world. And how we are receiving all these things in our bodies as well, because I think that's very important. Zara mentioned that. And also today we talked about the body as an archive. So yeah.
I think so. This is exactly what I've been working on. I think as much as and I think we talk about this in the conversation, but as much as we go to ascribe blame rightfully and responsibility to colonial powers, we have a lot of blame to ascribe to the myths of our independent states. Zimbabwe became a Shona state through a genocide, through this restructuring of pre-colonial history and translating it into this animus that revolved around the desires of the ruling party, right? The way that that I'm sure from what I understand about Kenya, it's like, there's both this enduring criminalization of the Mau Mau at the same time that there is this myth around them as the people who created the engine that brought Kenya its freedom, right? And so there are all of these different ethno-political ways that the people who were responsible for these ruling parties, and I think in Southern Africa, it's especially potent because I think Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa are still, well, maybe less in South Africa than previously, but are still being governed by the liberation parties. And the liberation parties always had these ethnic tones that then produced different ways of kind of interacting with the state. And so I think that you know, as much as the ethnic myth is imposed upon these communities are very, very keen to take the ethnic myth and to translate it into all of these things that Zara and I were describing around strategic essentialism and these claims to land and these claims to whatever, but most importantly, the claims to the state. And so I think what feels really important is to think about what ethnicity does, how it's kind of weaponized and how it's imposed and structured. But it's like the ethnic thing structures our lives, but we never actually have to think about how or why or when these things began to happen. It's just a part of what it means to be Zimbabwean, to be Ugandan, to be Kenyan, South African, whatever. So it's just about kind of deconstructing the post-colonial myth at the same time that we're just deconstructing the colonial myth, I think.
And I think like this kind of problematic or whatever is like very much exposed within the South African context around like who can and cannot claim Blackness. So this question of autochthony is actually like not that important in many ways, because most people in South Africa who are indigenous are not from this land, right? There's like all these different migrations, etc. And this is what I think is so interesting about that Huria cactus example that I mentioned, is that in the kind of the ways in which the Constitution is written and how we understand Blackness, etc. in this country, is that like the actual autochthonous people of this land are like the most disenfranchised from this kind of land restitution conversation. And so there's these kind of strategic essentialist strategies that need to be deployed in order to gain access to land when a normal kind of traditional land claim might not be available to them based on the ways in which Blackness is understood. Yeah, and so I think, and I think you mentioned that your work is perhaps more around the environment, but I think we cannot separate like this conversation from an ecological conversation. I think they're like, in order for us to fully understand again what's at stake, we have to be having these conversations simultaneously.
Not at all. Not at all. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to offer clarification. My work is not about the environment. My work is about ecology as a whole, which speaks to all the relationships of living things. And I understand the conflation, and I think that conflation is deliberate in the way that we are taught about ecology, where it's like the animals and then people, which is fictitious, and it's also part of what animates the anthropocentrism, English, of white supremacy, of like the human as the apex and the white human as the most deserving, the animal that should take up the most space. Yeah, so just wanted to say that.
Yeah, cool. We're totally aligned then. We're totally aligned.
I'm curious if there's anything methodologically speaking that became important to how the works were processed, and whether that's something, if there is that something that you think might carry forward, and is it something that can be offered as well, so that it can sort of expand on how things are seen and translated.
I think, I mean, Zara talked, I mean, she has I think we were both really, really, I think that Tina Kamp's work has been really profound for the both of us. And I think that what it enables is a study and a movement between, and like a translation between mediums. And not to keep gushing, but again, to go back to what I deeply appreciated in having to think about sound, was having to really confront all of the ways that I kind of take, and I think we all kind of take sound for granted. And so if we think with Tina, and I mean, my first encounter with her book was listening to images, is like applying the logics of sound to image. I think what was useful methodologically is trying to apply all of these political logics in different ways in respect to different kinds of mediums that then kind of come together in this constellation of the colonial episteme. So it would be, we would be remiss to believe that there isn't, a corresponding logic to the treatment of sound, to the treatment of image, to the treatment of ancestral remains, to the treatment of all of these things that then comes together to comprise this museopolitic. And I think one thing that we can do is kind of get caught up too much on a singular medium or a singular set of objects and forget that they exist in relationship to all of these other things that are taken for all of these different reasons, but then ultimately for the same reason, which is to kind of assert this dominant global structure of power and claims to land. And so I think that, like, approaching the property relation to each of these kinds of things for me felt really important. And maybe that coheres into a methodology. I don't know if it does. But at the very least, go read Tina Kamp. Maybe that's my methodological suggestion.
I think like adding onto that, a huge thing, I mean, obviously as someone who thinks with sound, like that's really the central component of, I would say, like my method, right? So whether I'm necessarily, even if I'm not creating a sound work, I'm still thinking with sound and thinking about how the Black sonic moves and how it operates, what are the kind of functions, is questions around call and response, questions around the sociality of the Black sonic. And in kind of centering sound, I would say, and what I sometimes call like performance technologies, I kind of developed this methodology of rapture. So maybe it might be useful to read the little fragment. So the way the book kind of functions, just so that you can see, there's these kind of big text sections on the big pages, and we have these kind of fragments that kind of echo or riff with elements in the big text, right? So it's an understanding that we're thinking really associatively. And so one of the small little fragments is this writing. Much of my work has been informed by what I have been devising as a methodology of rapture, an embodied collective pathway to elsewhere, collective flight or spiritual ecstasies that demand we take Black cultural innovation, fugitivity, and performativity seriously as sites of possibility in contexts of enduring settler colonial logics and landlessness. Rapture is the embodied, psychological, and mystical pathway toward collective flight, political fugitivity, and spiritual ecstasies. It is a petit marronage away from the conditions of enclosure and constraint in order to experience a moment of freedom or collectivizing towards freedom. Here I conceptualize rapture as a temporary restructuring where the open state of cosmic consciousness of freedom and fugitivity is restored, if only temporarily. To be enraptured, thus, is to be simultaneously inside of one's own body, yet in flight from the conditions under which the knowing, racialized body is usually rendered and constrained. So this kind of conceptual framework for me came out of doing lots of research with kind of syncretic churches, actually, and thinking about the ways in which sound functions in these contexts to kind of collectivize. It's this thing that functions in an ensemble. So in the South African context, it would be like Amazayoni or ZCC or Ama Nazareta and Shembe. But in the Cuban context, it could be Santeria, right? The way the drum is so central to how everything functions. And the drum is in and of itself an entity that allows the kind of sociality around it amongst people, but also between what's happening on this plane and the divine, right? So I'm really thinking about sound in this way, and rapture is this moment of being overcome by the spirit that sound really and sociality really facilitates. In the Colombian context, there's these alawaos, there's these funeral songs that function in very similar ways. And in Zimbabwe, there's the Mbira Zambos, which is the kind of, it's a divining kind of instrument. So this is a kind of methodology that I think I've been thinking through. And obviously the Mbira was really pivotal in the kind of chimarengas, right? In the resistance movement, allowing diviners to figure out how to like overcome the kind of colonial moment. Yeah, so that's my methodology that really informs a whole bunch of the work, and even the ways in which Zoe and I kind of were working with one another. Yeah.
Hi. I have maybe two questions. The first is maybe an anecdote. In Uganda, the question of land is also quite an interesting one. I mean, we don't have the same history where like the colonizer took the land, but the same history where so there's sort of like a dominant tribe, I guess, like economically, which is the one making all the money. But I was curious about, and because of that, but that dominant tribe is not from the area where the government sits, right? So they're buying up a lot of land that is not, they're making a lot of land state land that belongs to another sort of like kingdom or tribe. So I just wanted to know if there are any sort of like complications of capital in that, in like what you guys have found. And then my other question was just for Zoe. I wonder if you're going to be making more things now.
I think to the first question, I don't think it's complicated. If you have the state, you can buy whatever land you want. You can buy whatever land you want, and then you can impose whatever kind of historical claim onto the land that you want to claim. You can rewrite the history of the kingdom that is from that land and say, well, because they moved so much, how can we actually know that that's where they're from? You can do whatever you want when you run the state, and that's what makes kind of indigeneity and autochthony and the deliberate misunderstandings, or I guess we can call them contestations, of land of like land tenure and land ownership kind of so horrific. I mean, that's why I think it's so horrific to see like the relationships that governments have with these like multinational corporations that they're like enabling to like take land from whomever, wherever, which is a different but obviously very, very related, intimately related to the logic of whoever owns the state and whatever the state wants to do. It's like the Ovambo who run SWAPO and run the kind of Namibian state, allowing Shark Island, which was a concentration camp, to be turned into a campground. Whereas the Nama and Ovaherero have been petitioning for years and years and years to turn it into a kind of sacred site. They're begging UNESCO, they're begging the government, and now also the government is considering expanding the port that would effectively destroy the last resting place of these folks' ancestors. So, I mean, if you run the state, you can do whatever you want. You can reconstruct history however you want. And as far as making things, we'll see. I don't know. We'll see.
Another thing, I mean, you asked if we like speak about this a bit in the book. We don't really necessarily speak about it super directly, but we do mention the really important work of Daenerys Kosana, who is essentially her research. She's based at the university, well, at Wits University with SWAP. And her book is called No Last Place to Rest. I always forget the title, but essentially her research is looking at the ways in which mining companies in South Africa are kind of given license to I guess like occupy land and exhume all this land and essentially kick people who are living on this land off of it, right? So it's another kind of wave of removal. But what that also really means is that there are these graves that have been there for generations that then also there's a big question around what happens to these graves if we take our, if we take our understandings of ourselves seriously and our understandings of the dead seriously, right? Like you can't just leave your dead now in this place where a mining company is going to operate. So her work is really interesting in terms of this question of capital because it also exposes how there's been no provision for this within the South African Constitution, as celebrated as it may be. And so, it really kind of details the complexities around exhuming graves, relocating graves, the kind of price that is put per dead body. It's really quite crass, but I think it really speaks to like the clusterfuck, of the intersection of kind of capital, the black body, and the dead black body, right? Yeah.
Also, if you've never seen a movie called This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection, by this Botswana filmmaker Lemoheng Mosese, it's about a community that they're trying to convert the land into a dam, and so they're like, well, what do we do with the dead? Do we leave them here? Do we take them with us in the process of being displaced? So it's going to destroy you. Heads up. Are we wrapping up?
There's a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to say it out loud, but also we're time short. So I don't know, Zoe and Zara, do you have time to answer this question or should we?
Jay,
Yeah,
I'll email you.
How do you want to do it?
I'll email you.
Oh, sorry, one sec. Okay. All right, so we'll wrap up. Now, it's just notes. When you have the time to ask a question, ask the question. This was incredible. Like, wow, 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 wow. Really, I think we're all, maybe also that's why the question didn't come yet, because we're also just soaking it in. It just feels like just such a gift to have had your time, your brilliance, this book. Maybe if you can also, if you have time to put in the chat where people can find it. There's a question about if it's available in Paris and Cairo, but also you can send it to us and we can send this list and we can repost on socials and send an email to everyone who registered. But just so grateful, really, like this. I mean, you probably already know how brilliant you are, but we're just going to remind you real quick. And like, to be able to have this collaboration that also expands in the giving, right? Like, I think it just, you two together were able to create something that I think will have these tremendous echoes. And I would also love to see where else this can go, because I feel like we just scratched the surface. So, wow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you have, yes, we need to work out how to get you here. I'm going to unmute real quick, just if you have any last words, but those are the last words from us. Thank you so, so much. Waves from everyone. We really do appreciate this. So amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. I mean, it's been so lovely to also develop our relationship in this way. So I'm very, very grateful. And to Abul as well for asking really thoughtful questions and choosing really key sections for us to read. Questions around the book. Where can you get the book? In Paris? If you have a great bookshop that wants to stock the book, let us know. But there is nowhere in Paris and Cairo currently. We still do have copies. It is a limited edition of 150. So yes, it's a book, but it's kind of treated like an artwork in a way because it is editioned. But just email us at studio@zarajulius.com. I've put it in the chat and we can answer any kind of queries for institutional acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, we're in the process of trying to get some copies into a store in Berlin, but in the meantime, just drop us a mail. It's easier. For those in South Africa and Cape Town, you can get copies at Chimarenga at the moment. Yeah, to be continued.
I think they're saying something. Can't hear.
We're just asking Zoe if you had any last words as well.
No. I was like, what? No, Zara covered it. Thank you so much. Big fans of yours this side. So it was really wonderful to be able to have this conversation here.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone in the Zoom. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Conversation. We feel
Thank
so
you so
much.
much, everyone.
You were recording. Yeah. You also did the chat.